The mountain man found a Chinese woman in the blizzard and stayed until spring. The blizzard had swallowed the mountain pass so completely that even the pine trees looked like ghosts frozen in place. Their branches bent under the weight of snow as the wind screamed through the white void without direction or mercy. And in the center of that roaming storm, the Chinese woman lay half-buried beside the overturned supply sled. Her small body pressed into the drift as if the earth itself had tried to hide her from the cold, but had not been strong enough to save her. She had been traveling with a trade convoy that promised safe passage through the pass before winter sealed it shut. But fear had turned to panic when the storm arrived too early and too violently, and one by one the wagons fled the climb in chaos, leaving behind what slowed them, including the quiet woman who spoke little of their language and carried no power except endurance. Her boots had filled with snow hours ago. Her fingers were numb beyond pain, and every breath cut into her chest like broken glass as she struggled to rise again from the drift, only to fall back into it with less strength each time. The sled she had been guarding lay on its side, with broken supplies scattered like forgotten offerings to the storm. And the tracks of the departing wagons were already vanishing beneath fresh snow, as though the land itself meant to erase the proof that she had ever been abandoned there at all. Her lips moved faintly with a prayer shaped in her own language, not loud enough for the storm to hear and not strong enough to alter its path. And as darkness began to gather at the edges of the sky, she pulled her thin coat tighter with trembling hands that scarcely responded anymore. It was then, at the moment when the cold began to feel deceptively warm and sleep pressed in as a final surrender, that a dark shape moved through the white ahead of her. First no more than a shadow against shadow, then slowly resolving into the towering outline of a mountain man, pushing forward against the storm with long, deliberate steps. He had been tracking a wounded elk when the wind shifted and carried a sound that did not belong to the mountain. A broken cry swallowed almost completely by the storm, and following it had brought him to the shape in the snow that no animal could have made. When he knelt beside her, the storm tore at his coat and beard alike as he brushed snow from her face, and saw how young she truly was beneath the layers of fear and frost, her eyes barely open and clouded with a slow drift toward unconsciousness. He lifted her into his arms with a strength shaped not for ease but for survival, feeling how little weight remained in her body as the blizzard closed in harder around them. And without knowing her name, her journey, or her language, he turned his back to the storm and started down the mountain with the woman pressed against his chest, choosing in that instant not only to rescue her from the cold, but to interrupt the abandonment the blizzard had been finishing on behalf of men. The mountain man did not carry her far before the slope steepened and the storm grew louder in its low, endless roar. Yet he felt the faint rise and fall of her breath against his chest and knew that as long as that rhythm remained, retreat was not an option. He moved by instinct and memory more than by sight, angling toward a rock outcrop he used for shelter when winter struck early, every step driven into snow that tried to steal his footing, and every pause timed to keep the cold from reclaiming the warmth he was forcing back into her body. Her head rested against his shoulder, her hair stiff with ice, and though she did not speak, a small tremor passed through her now and then, as if her body still fought to remain present in the world, despite the blizzard's vast indifference. When at last he reached the narrow opening beneath the slab of stone that formed his storm shelter, he stooped inside and laid her carefully against the dry rock wall, shielding her from the worst of the wind with his own broad frame, before building up the small fire pit he kept for such moments. The fire took slowly, reluctant under wet kindling. But when the first flame finally caught and crept upward, its warmth brushed her face like a returning spirit, and she stirred faintly, her eyes opening just enough to take in the shape of him without understanding where she had been taken. He spoke to her in the only language he had, low and steady, not knowing if she understood even a word, yet trusting that the sound of a human voice carried a meaning older than speech itself. She watched him with wide, silent eyes as he wrapped her in dry hides and fed the fire again until the shivering in her body softened from violent shake into exhausted quiver. And though she still did not speak, the clouded edge in her gaze began to lift, replaced by something closer to awareness than surrender. As the storm pressed against the stone outside in relentless white fury, he sat near her with his rifle across his knees, not guarding against attacker or threat, but against the cold itself, which had nearly claimed her and would gladly reclaim her again if vigilance wavered even once. In that narrow shelter carved from mountain and chance, the mountain man became the first true witness, not only to her survival, but to the quiet truth that the woman the storm had tried to erase was still alive enough to be seen, and that seeing her now carried a responsibility no blizzard could take back. The rescue did not end when the mountain man pulled her from the snow, but only truly began when the cold refused to release its hold on her body inside the stone shelter, her breathing turning thin and dangerous as the fire struggled to fight back what the blizzard had already taken. He saw the warning signs at once in the way her lips lost color, and the trembling shifted from violent shaking into an eerie stillness. And he reacted with the same instinct that had carried him through every hard winter before, stripping off his thick outer coat and wrapping it tightly around her shoulders before pulling her fully against his chest to bring his own heat where the fire could not yet reach. He spoke to her steadily, not knowing if she understood the words, but knowing the sound of a human voice can sometimes anchor a fading spirit when warmth alone cannot. And he matched his breathing to hers so she could follow the rhythm back into steadiness. When the fire finally caught stronger and threw real heat against the stone, he moved with precise urgency, rubbing her frozen hands between his own, coaxing motion back into fingers that barely answered, pausing again and again to listen for her breath as if the storm might still try to steal it through the walls. He melted snow carefully and dripped warm water against her lips, one trembling drop at a time, watching in silent strain for each swallow that meant she had not yet surrendered. Then, faint and fragile, a breath escaped her that held more sound than before, and her fingers twitched against his sleeve with the bare beginning of return. Hour by hour he remained there without rest, feeding the fire, warming her limbs, speaking to her in low, steady tones, until at last the dangerous stillness broke fully into shallow but reliable breathing again. Near dawn, her eyes fluttered open and focused on him, not as a shadow, but as a presence, and the mountain man felt the turning point settle deep and undeniable inside his chest as he realized the storm had lost its claim on her life. Not by strength of weather, but by refusal of one man to let it finish what abandonment had begun. By the time pale morning light filtered weakly through the mouth of the stone shelter, the blizzard had eased into a distant, hollow wind, and the Chinese woman lay wrapped in dry hides near the fire, with her breathing now slow and steady, no longer fighting for each rise and fall. The mountain man watched her through the quiet hours without leaving his post, feeding the fire when it waned and turning the hides when frost crept back into their edges, the simple rhythm of protection settling into place without demand for recognition. When she finally stirred into full waking, her eyes moved first in confusion, then in careful realization as she took in the stone walls, the warmth, and the silent figure seated nearby. And this time fear did not seize her breath as it had before. He brought her warm water and then broth made from what little he had carried, and she accepted it slowly, each swallow returning strength that the storm had tried to take permanently. She attempted to speak again in her own language, softer now. And though he did not understand the words, he caught the change in her voice, the shift from panic into something closer to fragile gratitude. The shelter itself seemed to change as well, no longer a desperate hiding place, but a room shaped by warmth and steady presence. And outside, the drifting snow no longer felt like a threat pressing inward, but a quiet world held at a distance. When fatigue returned, she slept again without the rigid tension that had bound her body all night. And the mountain man allowed himself for the first time to sit back against the stone wall and feel the long strain ease from his shoulders. The safe haven did not come from the walls of rock alone, but from the simple, unwavering decision to remain through the danger rather than retreat once the worst had passed. And as daylight strengthened over the mountain pass, the woman rested not as a burden rescued from the storm, but as a life now held deliberately within its shelter. When the storm eased enough to let pale daylight slip through the mouth of the stone shelter, the woman woke to warmth that no longer felt borrowed from danger. And for several long moments, she simply lay still, listening to the unfamiliar quiet, the crackle of dying embers, the distant hush of wind rather than its roar. The mountain man was awake beside the fire, sharpening a blade with slow, steady strokes. And when he noticed her eyes open, he set the knife aside at once so she would not mistake readiness for threat. He offered her water again, and this time she drank with steadier hands, her gaze never leaving his face, as if measuring whether this safety was real or only another passing moment. She spoke softly in her own language, explaining something he could not understand. Yet the tone carried enough to tell him it was not fear, but meaning she was placing into the space between them. And he answered with equally few words in his own tongue, trusting that intention would bridge what language could not. When she gestured weakly toward herself, and then toward the storm-blind mountains beyond the shelter, he understood that she was telling him how she had been left. And the shame that flickered across her face told more than any translation could have. He shook his head once and set a hand flat against his chest, then pointed to the shelter and finally to the fire. A simple way of saying that whatever had abandoned her did not rule this place now. For the first time since he had found her in the snow, a faint change touched her expression. Not relief alone, but the beginning of trust shaped by being answered rather than ignored. As the hours passed, he prepared food again and showed her how to sip slowly so her strength would return without shock. And she watched every movement with careful attention, learning the rhythm of survival here not through fear but through quiet instruction. When she finally rested again, it was without the rigid tension that had held her body since the blizzard began. And the mountain man felt the shift clearly, the rescue giving way to something steadier, a bond forming not from promise or explanation, but from the simple truth that neither of them was alone in this frozen place anymore. The threat did not arrive with shouting or gunfire, but with distant movement across the white ridge that the mountain man noticed even before the woman sensed anything was wrong. A dark line of figures cutting slowly through the snow where no one should have been traveling so soon after a storm. He stepped to the mouth of the shelter and watched in silence until the shapes sharpened into men with pack horses pushing through the drifts, their direction aligning too closely with the abandoned trade route for chance to explain it away. When he returned to the shelter, his expression had changed, and though he spoke no warning aloud, the woman saw it in the way his shoulders tightened and the way he began to gather what few supplies he had left with deliberate care. She followed him with her eyes, confusion giving way to fear as she realized that the danger she had escaped from the blizzard might be finding a different path back toward her. Through broken words and gesture, she managed to convey that the men she had traveled with would not leave her easily behind once the storm cleared. Not for concern, but for loss of goods and answers they did not wish to explain. And in her halting confession, the mountain man heard the shape of pursuit rather than search. The figures on the ridge vanished briefly behind snow-laden rock and then appeared again lower on the slope, confirming what he already feared, that they were no longer merely passing through, but descending directly toward the shelter's line. The woman's hands trembled as she realized that even survival might not spare her from being reclaimed by those who had abandoned her first, and the old fear returned with sharp clarity. Not of weather now, but of men. The mountain man said little, only moved with quiet purpose, checking his rifle, tightening the strap of his pack, and shifting their small fire so it would not betray their position with rising smoke. As the sound of hooves faintly reached the stone walls through the thinning wind, both of them understood that the storm had only delayed the danger, not erased it, and whatever confrontations waited beyond the shelter would not be summoned by nature now, but by human claim and consequence. The shelter felt smaller as the figures on the ridge drew nearer, and though no sound yet reached the stone walls, the weight of what was coming pressed in on both of them with growing certainty, settling into the quiet like a held breath that refused to release. The Chinese woman sat near the fire with her hands folded tight in her lap, her eyes lowered not from weakness, but from the long habit of enduring fear inwardly rather than letting it show. And when she finally lifted her gaze to the mountain man, the question in it needed no words to be understood. Through a mixture of broken phrases and gestures, she made him understand that the men below were not only searching for lost goods, but for someone to hold accountable for the storm's cost, and that she, as the one left behind, would be the easiest burden to reclaim whether she was guilty or not. The mountain man listened in silence, feeling the old instinct rise in him to send danger away from the place he stood, even if it meant sending her with it. And the conflict twisted sharply inside his chest between the habit of survival and the responsibility he had already claimed by saving her life. She seemed to sense that choice forming in him, and turned her face slightly away, as if preparing herself once more to be passed along for the sake of another's safety. And the sight of that quiet expectation struck him harder than any weapon. He understood then that survival alone was no longer the measure of what mattered, not after he had watched her return from the edge of death with nothing but will and borrowed warmth to guide her back. The thought of leading her out into the open to face men who had already abandoned her once felt like a second betrayal dressed in the language of necessity. Yet the danger waiting at the shelter door could not be ignored either. The conflict deepened not into fear, but into a harder question of cost. What it would require of him to stand where he now stood, rather than retreat into the solitary mountain life he had always trusted. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and steady, telling her that running might save a body, but it would break something that had just begun to heal, and that whatever claim those men believed they held would not be answered by surrender. She studied his face, searching for doubt, and when she did not find it, a slow, uncertain change passed through her expression. Not relief yet, but the first fragile shape of belief that she might no longer face what was coming alone. The moment of choice arrived sooner than either of them wished, carried on the crunch of boots against packed snow and the sharp call of men testing the mountain for echoes. And the Chinese woman felt panic surge through her as the reality of being found closed in around the shelter. She moved instinctively toward the deeper shadows at the back of the stone chamber, prepared to disappear if disappearance might spare him from conflict. But the mountain man caught her wrist gently and shook his head, not in command, but in refusal to let fear decide the moment. He stepped forward into the open mouth of the shelter alone at first, his tall frame cutting against the white slope as the figures reached the ridge below and slowed at the sight of him. Surprise flickering across their posture when they realized they had not found an empty ruin, but a man who stood without retreat. When the lead trader called out demanding to know whether a woman had taken shelter there, the mountain man answered, not with explanation, but with presence, saying only that the storm nearly killed someone, and that no one who left another to die in such cold now held rightful claim over what survived it. The men argued from below about goods, losses, and the need to explain disappearance to buyers who would not accept weather as excuse. And with each word, the woman felt the old guilt rise again, ready to step forward and offer herself as the payment for their failures. But the mountain man refused to clear a path for that sacrifice. Instead, when the men advanced, he raised his rifle, not to fire, but to draw the unmoving line of consequence, and in that gesture offered not violence, but certainty that the cost of taking her would no longer be easy or bloodless. The wind carried tension through the narrow space as the men weighed profit against risk, and the woman stood shaking behind him, knowing that by staying she was allowing another man to stand in harm that had followed her across the mountain. After a long, brittle pause, the lead trader spat into the snow and said the mountain was free to keep what it nearly killed, and the figures turned back down the slope, not in defeat, but calculation, leaving behind the echo of pursuit postponed rather than ended. When their sounds faded at last, the mountain man lowered his rifle slowly, and the woman sank to the stone floor with the full release of fear that had been held too long. Understanding that his courage had not only saved her body once again, but had claimed her future from men who would have sold it back to winter, the silence that followed the trader's retreat settled over the shelter with a different weight than fear, quieter and steadier, as if the mountain itself were acknowledging a line that had finally been drawn and held. And the Chinese woman rose slowly from the stone floor where she had sunk in release, her legs still unsteady, but her gaze changed in a way the mountain man recognized at once. She stepped closer to him without shrinking this time, lifting her hands in a gesture that was half gratitude and half disbelief that such refusal on her behalf had been possible at all. And though the words she spoke were foreign to him, the meaning crossed the space between them with clarity and force. For the first time since the blizzard, he did not feel like a lone wall against the world, but part of a joined stance shaped by mutual choosing rather than accident. They rebuilt the small fire together afterward, her hands careful but willing as she helped arrange the new wood he brought in. And in those simple shared motions, the tension left behind by the confrontation dissolved into something closer to belonging. Later, when the storm quieted fully and the sky cleared into a brittle winter blue, he led her outside for the first time since her rescue, guiding her steps across the hardened snow as she took in the wide mountain silence. Not as a threat now, but as a space she had survived and claimed. Far below, the trade route stretched empty and distant, its failure to end her life now certain and complete. And in looking at it, she understood with sudden certainty that she did not belong to those men anymore. Not by accident, not by loss, and not by guilt. The mountain man watched her stand there in the open light without trembling, and felt the union take its quiet form within him, not through promise or law, but through the shared truth that they had faced the same danger and chosen the same boundary. No oath was spoken, and no future named aloud. Yet both of them understood that what had been isolated as survival only days before had now shifted into shared ground, and that justice had arrived not as punishment, but as freedom returned openly and without condition. Winter loosened its grip slowly across the mountain, not in sudden mercy, but in patient retreat. And as the days lengthened, the shelter that had once been a desperate refuge became the steady center of two lives, reshaped by survival and choice. The Chinese woman grew stronger with each passing week, her movements no longer cautious with fear, but careful with intention as she learned the rhythms of the land and the quiet patterns of the mountain man's life, helping with food, fire, and the small daily labors that turn isolation into dwelling. The mountain man watched the season change with unfamiliar awareness, no longer measuring time only by storms and game trails, but by her recovering laughter, by the steady return of warmth to her hands, and by the way the shelter filled with something he had never named but now felt clearly. When spring finally broke the last crust of snow along the lower ridges, green pushing through white in small stubborn signs, the woman stepped outside and breathed the open air without flinching for the first time since the blizzard had nearly erased her, and the mountain no longer felt like a prison of cold, but a place that had chosen not to finish what winter began. They stood together at the edge of the thawing valley and looked down toward routes that once led only to loss, neither of them obliged now to follow those paths again unless they wished to. And in that freedom purpose arrived without announcement. She no longer belonged to the traders, the storm, or the road that abandoned her. And he no longer belonged only to the silence of survival. For the mountain had given them both something rarer than shelter. A shared future built not from debt or rescue alone, but from the steady choice to remain. When the first birds returned and the high wind softened into moving warmth, the Chinese woman looked at the mountain man and spoke his name the way one speaks home. And he understood at last that staying until spring had become staying beyond it. Sometimes survival is only the doorway to something far greater than safety. Thank you for walking this winter road of courage and belonging with us. May the shelters you find grow into lasting purpose and peace.